1, 2, 3, blah, blah, blah. I get paid to blah, blah, blah. My name's Susan Arbetter, and welcome to what I believe is the final panel discussion of the day called Moving Forward Next Steps. And we have a great bunch of people joining us here. Steve Allinger is from NYSA, New York State United Teachers, where he is the Director of Legislation. Barbara Bartoletti is the Legislative Director for the League of Women Voters. Bob Lowry is the Deputy Director of the New York State Council of School Superintendents. Ron Deutsch is, we've got so many titles lately, it's hard to keep track, but Executive Director of the Fiscal Policy Institute and New Yorkers for Fiscal Fairness. And Joe Mariani is the County Administrator for Tompkins County. And we're going to be talking today about a variety of different issues, from the tax cap to school financing to pensions. And some of my questions are going to be a little provocative, but there will be no throwing of punches. All right, so why don't we begin with Joe Mariani of Tompkins County. The Cuomo tax cap sunsets in 2015, I believe. It's either beloved or reviled, depending on where you sit. Do you think it should be renewed or not? And what does this have to do with mandate relief?
It should not be renewed. It was ill-conceived to begin with. It was based on a false... I should stop now, shouldn't I?
You should leave on a high note like George.
It was based on a false premise that local governments are profligate, we're wasteful, we duplicate each other, we're inefficient. And I think if you look at the facts, and many of those facts have been presented today, that's absolutely not the case. One of the early panelists, Matt Cook, said that before there was a tax cap, there was something else called voters. And it was voters that kept us honest and always working to find new ways of delivering public services more efficiently than we had before. That has often involved the kinds of shared services and consolidations and mergers that the governor is now proposing as if it's a new concept. So again, I think it was based on a false premise to begin with. It also has an element of blaming the victim, that when you look at the causes of property tax increases in local governments, you'll find that, and again, this has been documented today, that many of those causes are really because of the way New York State has shifted its own costs to local governments and imposed mandates, in the case of counties, literally shifted its bills to county governments for counties to pay through property taxes. So there were a couple of premises that were made when the cap came about. One was we're going to cap property taxes, and that's a good thing. And then the second part of that was we're going to provide meaningful mandate relief, meaning the state was going to pick up some of its own costs to provide some relief to local governments. We could stay within that cap. And that second part of the equation never happened. So I think it's time to start all over. And I do think it's time for a strong focus push on the cap is going to be here, meaningful mandate relief.
So, Ron, I saw you looking at me, giving me the eye. I know that you have something to say about the tax cap. And what about also the tax cap 2.0, which some people call the tax freeze?
Right. So I think a lot of people in the audience got their $9 to $29 freeze checks. Clearly, that was well worth $1.5 billion that we're spending on those, right? I'm not a fan of the tax cap. I think everybody knows that already. I don't want to see it reauthorized, but as a pragmatist, I feel like it's going to still be around. I think we can modify it, but I think the reality is that the rhetoric that our governor is using to justify the tax cap is based on a faulty premise. So the governor is basically saying that, property taxes are high because local governments and school districts don't have their fiscal houses in order. I think that's a faulty premise. I think the other reality is when, the governor likes to wanted to model this tax cap, or had Governor Patterson modeled the tax cap after Massachusetts. Governor Cuomo has supported that, certainly. Big difference between the two. Massachusetts had a major infusion of capital into education before they when they enacted the tax cap. We went in the exact opposite direction. And as the students pointed out today, the state share of education funding is basically at a 65-year low. I mean, we're talking about the state share being somewhere around 35%, 38% if you include STAR. If you look at aid and incentive to municipalities over the last 30 years, we've seen about an 80% reduction in that funding stream. So the reality is it's a bit disingenuous to wonder why property taxes are going up. Basically, what the problem has been is the state share has been shrinking and the local share has been growing. We need to reverse that paradigm.
Bob, how has the tax cap affected school districts across the state?
Well, first I'd say when the tax cap was being debated, we said our position was so simple it could be expressed in just 10 words. A tax cap will hurt our schools. There are better options. And we said those better options are for the state to be a reliable partner in helping to pay for schools, mandate relief, and a circuit breaker to provide targeted help to the most stressed taxpayers. How has the tax cap hurt schools? There's been a confluence of things hurting schools, all coming at the same time. And, as Joe said, local government school districts have been dealing with voters, since their inception. And in particular with school districts, I don't think there's a more democratically accountable institution in this state or perhaps in this country than school districts in New York State. We have to put our budgets up for a vote every year. Cities, counties, towns, and villages don't have to do that. We put out tons of data. Our boards are elected by the voters. And before the tax cap was enacted, districts were holding down spending and taxes. And they were doing that even when they were absorbing cuts and freezes in state aid. And then we had the tax cap. And state aid has been better, and that has helped. But the tax cap has forced districts to, state aid typically has not provided the help that was lost through state aid cuts. Peter Appleby mentioned 51% of the districts in the state are still getting less help from the state than they were in 08-09. And we've also had some costs going up. Health insurance is a struggle for all employers, not just school districts. Pension costs spiked after the stock market collapse, and that was a cost that school districts couldn't absorb any other. The only way they can adjust their pension obligations is by laying off people, eliminating jobs. They can't tell the retirement systems we don't want to pay that amount. So school districts have had to wrestle with all those things. And we've done surveys each year on the impact. And this past year, even after 2 years of state aid increases, only in school security did more superintendents say their budget had a positive impact than a negative impact. 18 other categories, extra help for students who need it, basic instruction, so forth and so on. Everything else, they said, more superintendents said their budget had a negative impact than a positive impact. And it's all been cumulative. Something that strikes me when I spoke to superintendents in this region a few years ago was how many of them said, I worry that kids in the future will never have the opportunities that kids in the past have had.
Barbara, we're going to get back to you, but I want to come to Steve Allinger next because there was a great segue there from Bob Lowry, who was talking about pensions, health care. These are things, these are described by some in the political bubble in Albany as the mandates that we need relief from. They're also very important to the union. How do you sort of rectify those two things or reconcile those things?
First of all, on pensions, the teacher retirement system has just announced at least a 4 percentage point reduction from, I think, around 18 to 14%. Could be 4.5. So the strong recovery we've had in the markets has already corrected the loss of value in that fund.
Although the same can't be said for the Common Retirement Fund.
No, the Common Retirement Fund will have reduced rates. In fact, they announced a reduced rate earlier. I'm absolutely positive of that. And we have almost fully funded public pension funds that return, where 80% of the payments to retirees stay in the communities. They provide a lot of economic stimulus. It stabilizes communities. It keeps older retirees from having to be dependent on the social services of local governments. So it's frankly, it has been a great boon. And these are extremely well managed and extremely efficient. And all experts, right, left, in the middle, say 401ks will not get you retirement security. On health insurance rates they've decelerated in terms of their increases. And I think it was reported that overall health insurance premium increases were around 5%, which was considered low, but obviously way above a 2% or a 0% or a 1.3% cap. Health insurance is an area where I would urge that we use this conference to look at greater regional collaboration and health insurance pools. I've heard many great things about intergovernmental cooperation, collaboration around health insurance. Health insurance isn't going to be fixed by just denying people basic health security or in a food fight between labor and management. It's going to be tackling some of the cost issues and also having common sense exemptions in the tax cap. We don't have an exemption for enrollment, so we don't pay for the unaccompanied minor and refugee children, like in Brentwood, Utica, Buffalo. We can't control international price spikes in energy. Why is that subjected to an arbitrary cap that has no relationship to costs beyond the control of employers and their employees? So I know that's a long answer, and you're giving me that look, so I'll stop.
You're reading into the look. But real quickly, so would you then want to just amend or fix the tax cap, Steve Ellinger, or do you want to just, say enough already, let's get rid of the tax cap?
I think we don't like the tax cap. NYSET was on record supporting a circuit breaker that would have provided real need-based tax relief to people who are literally being taxed on their homes, seniors on fixed incomes, people who have lost their jobs. And it's a shame that this moment was squandered on poor policy. That being said, knowing that it's already in law and unlikely to be jettisoned in its entirety, we think we should look at Massachusetts and New Jersey the way that the great work was done by our friends at Cornell. New Jersey has exemptions for health care, pensions, debt service. Massachusetts has exemptions. They look at enrollment. New Jersey honors its version of the Campaign for Fiscal Equity. They have an exemption invoked by, I think, their state ed commissioner to help address struggling schools in terms of their academic achievement. So they don't just override equity. There's a positive correlation in New Jersey between student need and poverty and additional aid. There's a negative correlation in New York State where we do less for those who need more. And that's a shame. So we should learn from our neighboring states and take to heart the phenomenal research that was put together by Mildred Warner, Rod Howe, John Sipple, the students. We're deeply grateful for the presentations.
I'm giving you the look now. So let's go back to Barbara. Governor Cuomo has said that the tax cap was one of his signature achievements. So as Steve alluded to, is there really any chance that this is going to be sunsetting next year?
Well, to be perfectly honest with you, I think someone noted this morning, depends on what it gets tied to, and if it gets, we're going to do rent control this year, that sunsets, we have a tax cap that everybody here, including the league, would like to see changes made to it. We now have a Republican Senate in full control. I think the IDC is hoping to latch its star to this new majority.
Mayoral control, charter schools.
Control, charter schools. This governor has already come out and said, unfortunately, that public education is a huge monopoly. He would apparently like to break, I guess, taking a page out of Scott Walker in Wisconsin, perhaps. So I think the problems around the tax cap are significant this coming session, and I think it is going to take educating, as I think Steve just talked about. We need to get the data. We need to work together, perhaps in refining a message that literally we can use in both the people we need to get to in the Assembly, Democrats, because of the rent control issue, and leverage what we can do politically to ameliorate some of the problems that we all have observed with the tax cap.
It's important to create a narrative.
It is.
Right? So I want to ask Joe Mariani, what would the narrative be that you're trying to sell the lawmakers on?
Well, ours is, and remember I speak from the perspective of a county, so our message is often a little different than other levels of local government, but we've tried to simplify our message. And first of all, explaining clearly what the property tax freeze will do to an average homeowner. First of all, it's only for homeowners. And second, to really burst the balloon of this sense that it's a $350 rebate check for an average homeowner, we did some calculations and found that the rebate check for a county homeowner in Tompkins County is $7. So in terms of trying to provide perspective in the benefit of one aspect of the property tax cap and freeze, the rebate check, when people heard it was $7, that was pretty enlightening. And then our message is, we think there's a better and we think there's a different and better way of achieving what the governor wants to achieve, which is property tax relief. And we think that the way to do that is for, again, the state to pay its own bills, to take over the cost of, for example, Medicaid. If you look at the cost of Medicaid, and I crunched some numbers over the weekend, and Mark is here, it looks like Medicaid, the cost of Medicaid borne by counties, is about half of what counties levy in property taxes.
Say that one more time.
It's about half of what counties levy in property taxes. So, assuming that number is right, then if you want meaningful, sustained property tax reduction, have the state pay its Medicaid bill.
Now, the governor has already said, hey, we don't have enough money to do that.
Could I speak to that?
His words were, if I had a printing machine in the Capitol the way the federal government has a printing machine, I could print the money, but I don't, so I won't.
Let me speak to that. I think that's a really important point, and we hear that point often. Right. I think that's the wrong paradigm. I think that's the wrong way to explain it. The governor doesn't have any more money than the county does. We draw money from taxpayers. And which pocket we draw from is important. Some people will say, well, what difference would it make? Either the county pays it, raises it through property taxes, the state pays it, raises it through income. Who cares, left pocket, right pocket? Well, it does matter. Because the property tax, the way we raise our money, is regressive, it's rigid, it doesn't change with life circumstance. It is a pretty poor way of raising money to support a progressive program. That is much different than what the state has, which is a somewhat progressive, broad-based tax and a portfolio of other revenues that they can use to pay for this program.
And give us an example of a revenue that we could tap that we haven't.
Well, again, it would relieve the taxpayer of a significant property tax burden. And remember, our property tax base is also riddled with exemptions. My county has Cornell University, Ithaca College, and a number of other exempt institutions. So it's a tax riddled with exemptions. If that cost could shift to the state, broad tax base, there's a number of different revenue sources, and it's a relatively progressive tax base, there is a benefit that results to that average homeowner in my county. So it does make a difference whether it's left pocket or right pocket.
Did you want to say something, Steve?
No, I'm agreeing with him.
Oh, okay.
Just to follow up, I mean, you said kind of show me the money, right? I mean, so New York spends $7 billion a year on economic development programs, incentives, tax abatements, tax credits, tax subsidies, with very little results, with very little job creation, with very little accountability. I think we could certainly be looking at reprogramming billions there to help pay for Medicaid. Again, so I agree with Joe completely in the sense that the state has a more diverse tax base in the sense that the state taxes that are collected are based more on ability to pay, whereas property taxes are not. So what we've seen in New York over the last 30 years is a reduction in those taxes based on ability to pay, right? We've cut the top rates of the personal income tax despite the, momentary millionaire's tax that we have in New York, which is temporary in nature, but generates billions of dollars in a responsible way, and again, based on ability to pay. So what we need to do is shift the tax burden, in my opinion, from local governments back to the state government, have the state pick up more of these costs. So we're not burdening local governments with this problem. Now, the governor will say, look, local governments, school districts, tighten your belts. I had to tighten my belt, you tighten yours, right? We've heard him say that before. But the reality is the way the state tightens its belt is by tightening localities and school districts' belt for them. So it's a bit disingenuous, to say the least. And I think we need to, again, reverse this trend that's been occurring over decades in New York. It's not going to happen overnight, but we need to right-size this ship of state and get it back on track.
And it's going to be difficult this session because, and the League does a lot of this work, so it kind of pops up in every discussion we have. The governor was reelected with a whole bunch of big donors. And I think, you could look at the
In what industries? Tell us about the industry.
In real estate industries and in the hedge fund people, more pertinent to perhaps this discussion, were the big hedge funds who gave $14 million to different campaigns, both at the state Republican level.
Just
and
one
at the
PAC gave
That's
$14
right.
million.
Yes. And what do they want for that? Not only do they want, the real estate, and I don't.
The co-location rental
Well, yes,
thing.
but they want real estate, the bottom line of their real estate interest to be lower, however you want to phrase that. And I have a feeling probably that Ron knows the words better than I do for that. But he's going to give something to his big donors. And one of that something he's going to give is going to lower the tax revenue for New York State, and that is in the effect of the tax credit, education tuition
tax credit.
Investment credit, yes, which is going to give to a large number up to what? Over the next couple of years, $300 million. Well, that's revenue the state could be using for its fiscal equity high-risk districts that it's not going to use. So not only are we not dealing with the tax cut, the tax cap, rather, we're just piling things up to give people who really don't need the money and shifting it away from the counties and the schools that do.
I want to bring, yeah. Steve?
If we're still on the theme of building a legislative agenda for next year, you got to comment, there's a $5 to $7 billion surplus. So this started off this conversation about printing press.
Windfall.
Well,
Settlement.
It's a surplus that gives us an opportunity to pay down some of the long-term liabilities that are stressing local governments, whether school districts, towns, municipalities, counties, meet some critical infrastructure needs that they otherwise would have to burden local property taxpayers with. So address some emerging needs that were unanticipated, whether it was ill effects of Superstorm Sandy, other natural events, whether it's a sudden influx of refugee children, funding the growth that you see that's not permitted either in school aid or in the tax cap in a lot of our urban centers. So I think that we can have a rational discussion about a fair way to take some of that money, which frankly was ill-gotten gains. A lot of this money was recovering from people who wrecked the economy, engaged in deceptive practices to defraud people and hurt the pension funds and hurt local governments and the state treasuries. So it's fair then to look at that recovery money to help repair the damage.
That's a narrative.
That's
right?
a narrative.
Yeah, that's the kind of narrative that lawmakers need to hear in order to get sold on a particular idea. Bob Lowry, we're going to pivot now toward a more education-centric conversation. Before the governor was elected, as Barbara mentioned, he made some very controversial comments about busting the state's public education monopoly. To many people, that meant an investment in charter schools. And I'm wondering how school districts in upstate cities like Albany, Syracuse, and Buffalo, where they already have this tug of war over education money, will be affected by something like that.
Sure. And first of all, I'll say in response to the monopoly comments, we have, I think, two basic ways of creating accountability. One is markets, and charter schools, private schools, they're part of that. The other is democratic accountability, voters, being accountable to voters. And I touched on this before, and I say, school districts, public school districts really are institutions that are of, by, and for the people. Our leaders are elected from the community. I see them in the grocery store, in the pizza shop, veterinarian's office, so forth. Our employees, they're people who have dedicated their lives to helping children. And we serve all children, whatever their circumstances, wherever they come from, whenever they come. As Steve said, we've been coping with this influx of unaccompanied minors. So that's part of my response to this issue of the public monopoly comment. The impact. I'm struck talking to superintendents from around the state. Charter schools to this point have been concentrated really in New York City, Buffalo, Rochester, and Albany. Yet there is a lot of concern about how charter schools will affect already recognition that charter schools can have a severe negative impact on school districts wherever they appear. And that's partly because districts do not realize dollar for dollar savings for a kid moving from a district school to a charter school. Only if all of Mrs. Smith's third grade class do you lose enough kids to eliminate a teacher's position. If they're scattered through different schools within your district or different classes, it becomes harder. Also, districts have to maintain some capacity to reabsorb those kids because charter schools don't hang on to all the kids that they take in. So those are challenges for districts, and in the city of Albany, essentially, the city is supporting two school systems now: a district system and a charter system. And again, the district system suffers because they lose more than they gain in savings, and because they have to maintain this capacity to take back kids.
It was during this moment during the Pataki administration, right before a new session began, when lawmakers wanted a pay raise, that the charter law was passed by the legislature. I can't remember when this was.
1998 went into effect in 99.
Okay, thank you.
We were there all night.
We have a lot of institutional memory here tonight. So we have this, I'm not sure that there's going to be a special session. Barbara, what's your gut feeling? And would charters be on the agenda?
And so often that what happens in politics is from some outside source that you wouldn't think about. I think there's not going to be a special session because the governor's father is so ill.
Oh, interesting.
And the logistics now between Hanukkah and the holidays and people making plans already, I think we've run out of time.
Yeah, it would have to be Monday, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and I think we've just run out of time.
I think there
Let's
was
hope so.
I think there was a report in the New York Times where the issues may be narrowing. There may be an outside chance where pay raise become has a better chance if it's tied to ethics, outside income restrictions, and that so the
Although we've heard that story before.
And from our perspective also is if you're going, we don't have a position on pay raises. However, we do have a position on process, and doing a pay raise without hearings on maybe ethical changes and what would be good ethical changes, rather than doing it either at, they go into session at 4 o'clock and, it gets done at 2 a.m., which is what happened the last time. That process irritates good government groups. So we're thinking that even though we don't have a position on pay raises, the process under which this would be done, we would not approve of.
Okay. I want to keep it on the education focus here. Another issue that may be affected by the governor's ideas regarding public education is teacher evaluations. Steve, what are your concerns regarding his interest in this particular topic and his ideas about reform?
Well, we would agree that the teacher evaluation process has problems as currently constituted. It's over-reliant and misuses high-stakes testing that is not predictive or reliable for evaluating teachers. It wasn't designed for that purpose. It's led to over-testing, which is an economic and fiscal stress. It also diverts school leadership's attention, teachers' attention, from deeper teaching and learning mission that they all share. So from a mandate relief point of view, it makes more sense to use multiple measures of effective teaching practice to get away from just driving up profits for Pearson and other outside corporations, and not treat this as a political football. We can have an evaluation system that informs instruction, gets information back to teachers so they can use it diagnostically, judging strengths and weaknesses of their students, gets it into the hands of parents, and stop using it as a gotcha and shaming tool that is inaccurate and breeds resentment. We're very confident that we can work with the other education stakeholders and come up with common sense changes that would improve its accuracy, that would make it much more of a constructive tool. And we think that it's shameful for groups to use the issue just as a way to demonize educators who've dedicated their lives to children, and will oppose negative attacks.
Bob?
Yeah. Perhaps it's a mistake to read too much into the sort of cryptic comments that make it into the news, but I'm disturbed that in what I have read of the governor's comments, the focus seems to be entirely about getting the right number, right percentage of teachers in each rating category, right percentage ineffective, right percentage effective, so forth and so on. Why do we do evaluations? To improve teaching and school leadership. How does it do that? By helping us to make formal employment decisions, who to give tenure to, who to promote, who to try and dismiss. Also, probably more important, because in any given year, very few teachers are going to be subject to those kinds of decisions. The more important purpose is to improve daily instruction and building leadership. And we've done surveys of superintendents, and at best they are withholding judgment on the usefulness of the evaluation system for making those formal employment decisions. On the other hand, they are seeing some value in improving teaching. And related, they see very little value in the student performance-based parts of the evaluation system, but 69% of them said, we're getting more value out of classroom observations, the traditional parts of teacher evaluation. The APPR did lead districts and unions to have good conversations about what does good instruction look like, how do we evaluate it, and also to do a more careful job with their observations. But the last point, and Steve touched on this, is common sentiment is the juice isn't worth the squeeze. The benefits we get from this do not justify the amount of labor that's involved. It's an overwhelming demand on teachers, on principals. I feel most sorry for them because they're both evaluated under the system and they have to do all these evaluations of teachers. So that's something I think NYSET, superintendents, principals, and probably school boards as well could agree on is, are there ways we can reduce the administrative demands of this system?
I want to talk about Schenectady and Middletown. These are two school districts that have gained some traction with the Federal Department of Civil Rights with a claim that says the way New York State funds schools discriminates against districts with large minority populations. Ron, do you have thoughts on this? If not, we can go to...
Not specifically on it, but I would also suggest when you look at some of our upstate Big Five school districts, you see school districts where half the children are living in poverty. So our upstate cities like Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, Utica, Schenectady, half the kids are living in poverty, and they have graduation rates hovering between 55 and 60%. So I would suggest there's a direct correlation there between number of students living in poverty and educational outcomes. And until we start to address the fact that all these children are living in poverty and having a difficult time learning, we're not going to really start to address some of these problems.
Bob?
I have not looked at the data that Schenectady and Middletown are referring to in a couple of years, so I can't really speak to that. But it does, the tax cap comes into play. Minority children tend to be concentrated in urban areas. Peter Appleby said, we don't have a big enough sample to make judgments about successful override attempts because there have been so few of them. But what we can see is that high-need districts are about half as likely to try to override the cap as average and low-need districts. These poorer districts are less likely to try. And I've looked. It's not a big sample of districts attempting overrides, but other than the Curious Joel School District, a very unique school district in Orange County, no high-need small city or suburban school district has been successful in overriding the tax cap. And so, again, I haven't looked at the data that they're relying on, but the tax cap can have the impact of hurting funding for school districts that have high concentrations of minority children.
And Susan, one of the things that I think was talked about at various times this morning, but don't forget, this legislature has not really dealt in a budgetary fashion with the CFE case that actually this Court of Appeals, 13 years ago, Steve, are we 12 or 13 years ago, to fully fund. We were, embarking on that, and then they decided to do something and didn't do latter. And then the economic, recession happened.
Came, sure.
And so we have never funded fully CFE, which was meant for these high needs districts. So if we haven't fully funded it yet, there should be certainly a focus, and I think some of these law cases now are attaching themselves to the fact that CFE has never been fully funded. Until we do that, we're not going to be able to help these high needs districts.
Let me throw this out, okay, because this is something, Barbara, that you can speak to better than anyone, and that is that the way the legislature funds schools is driven by politics, not need. Perhaps you can explain the old shares agreement and how that basically indicates who's going to get what, and it doesn't always meet the needs of schools like Schenectady and Middletown.
Right. And with a little help from my friend sitting next to me,
yeah.
I will attempt that. Right now, as of the 2014 November elections, the Senate again has a full 32 votes for the Republicans. So Dean Skelos, who is from Long Island, will be the majority leader. I don't think he's going to get voted out. I think he's already been voted in.
I think he's already voted
in. And Long Island, as many of the people in this room know, because they have a pretty full contingent of Republican senators.
9.
Thank you. Actually makes sure during the budget process, that their shares, even though many of their school districts are affluent school districts. Now, there are some on Long Island that aren't, and they do have to watch out for that. But it's all about a political dance of if we get enough shares for our Long Island schools, we're going to stay in power, and to hell with the other high needs rural districts wherever they might be in the state. Now, you can, Steve, probably tell us exactly during the negotiations how the shares are decided.
I'm trying to forget that chapter of my career. Often we'd arrive at an arbitrary number like 38.86 and then obsess about not hitting the 6 at the end. But the fact of the matter is we don't have a real formula. Even the dumbest formula counts kids. We don't. We have a tax cap that doesn't count them because it's not based. There's no exemption for enrollment, as there is in our neighboring states. And we don't count kids in the formula. We're just doing arbitrary calculations to add on an arbitrary year going back to, 2009? And so for the last 5 years, it's just a jerry-rigged allocation of additional aid based on what you used to get during the Great Recession. And the consequences have been it's been exacerbated by the layering over of the tax cap and the freeze, which just results in more affluent districts getting a higher yield for the same tax effort, therefore widening the disparity that was beginning to close. The foundation formula that was adopted in 2007 worked. The state did do a good thing.
It was more
perfect,
equitable.
But we were seeing a reduction in inequity. For a modest tax effort, struggling districts were able to increase funding for teaching and learning, and they were held accountable. They had to submit plans for the additional funding, so it was a well-balanced law. That was abandoned through a freeze that's still in place, and then a cut through the GEA. So now we're cumulatively between the two things, $5.2 billion behind. But what we need to do is restart it. And I don't want to leave the towns and villages and counties out because they've been great participants in this conference. There was supposed to be an 8% contribution. It hasn't materialized. And AIM payments, I know 1 year they just wiped them out and restored it for some and not others. And they're facing the same kind of Hunger Games scenario. There's competing. We're sometimes we're sometimes in a position where we feel we're competing, but that's a miserable situation. Why in the world would any teacher or educator want their kids not to have sanitation, clean water, parks, and recreation? We need a community alliance between all local governments. And we should do what the Cornell student said. We should have social indicators where we measure not just budget balance, but we measure the mission indicators of what these governments are supposed to provide at a very minimum. So there is no formula. That's a
myth.
It's not a bad formula. It's not a good formula. It's a no formula. And we need to restore real need-based sanity to both aiding school districts and municipalities.
What we're going to do is get final comments from Joe and Ron, and then I think we have a few minutes to open it up for some questions.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank the Cornell students for the work they did. There are times, maybe it's a reflection of my age, when I feel kind of like one of those grumpy Muppet guys in the balcony. We'll sit together. So I think it's pretty clear about where we are with the tax cap and how we think that there should be mandate relief that takes care of at least a part of the problem. But in listening to the students and in the other presentations today, there's a positive side to this conversation as well. One thing the governor's initiative has done is to basically elevate again that our communities look at shared services. Is there anything left? And we've used a council of governments, which is a good way to communicate between governments, to find common areas of interest and ownership. We've used our council of governments. They've set up a shared services committee to look at things that maybe we would have backburnered without this initiative from the governor. So we're looking at things as simple as back office services and whether those can be centralized, to public safety, almost a third rail, to municipal courts, which are a third rail, to see, is there anything that might be here in the way of either cost savings or something that came up today. Let's not forget that there may be quality improvements too if we find ways to share services between local governments. And so we're doing that, and that's a positive thing. The students talked about how things might be data-driven, because when we do provide services, we want to make sure that they're at absolute efficiency. And so it's not only looking at indicators about kind of cost-benefit and the effectiveness, but also those social indicators. If we're trying to address a certain social problem, how effective are we in addressing that? And I think that's something that local governments need to do and want to do more of. We're also, in being required to submit what's called a government efficiency report next summer, it has also caused us to remind ourselves what we've already done, and in the process giving us an opportunity to let our taxpayers know what we have done over the course of the last 20 or 30 years in shared services, to create an inventory so that we can let our community know, here are some good things that have happened that didn't make the front page. We have a health benefits consortium. We have a 911 center. We have a 2-county community college. We have a bunch of things that we have done. And we're going to use this as an opportunity not only to look deeper at what else we can do, but also to let our taxpayers know what we have already done to keep those dollars down. So there are some good things that are happening from this. And again, the energy that we get from the students and new insights into how we should approach these things, I found very positive today, so I really appreciate the effort that all of you put into these projects.
Ron Deutsch, final word.
All right, so I think we've been on a starvation diet long enough, whether we're talking about our schools, whether we're talking about our municipalities, county governments, our human service providers, our nonprofit providers. We've been living under a 2% state tax cap. We've been living under a 2% property tax cap. We now have the property tax freeze and the government efficiency requirements under that. So we continue to disinvest and hope things get better. Well, that's resulted in, what, a $7 billion surplus that we have now, much of that from settlement monies with many of the banks on Wall Street. Some of that a result from savings from this self-imposed 2% state tax cap. We need to start investing again to grow our economy. So we need to scrap these caps that are artificially in place, in particular the state spending cap, and we need to start investing again. Because we've been hurting our citizens in this state, not only in our children and our schools by limiting their access to different course offerings, to different programs, eliminating their teachers, but we're also hurting them through diminished funding for things like social and human services. We've cut over $1 billion in human services over the last 5 years or so as well, and what have we seen? Dramatically increasing child poverty rates. We've seen the greatest hunger in New York State that we've ever seen, and we're seeing the greatest number of homeless in New York State that we've ever seen. So these are not problems that are going away. These are problems that are getting worse under the current fiscal requirements of the state and local government. So I think there's a broad agreement here from many of the people that have participated in this conference that we need to start investing again. We need to fully fund our schools and meet the CFE figure that's been put out there year after year and start honoring the Campaign for Fiscal Equity lawsuit. We need to increase aid and incentive to municipalities, our revenue sharing with our cities, towns, and villages to help them thrive again, help them to address poverty in their cities, help them to invest in infrastructure and the things that make cities livable. So we talk a lot about business and the need to cut these services to help improve our business climate. Well, I would suggest what business wants the most is A, an educated workforce with a skill level that'll help them meet the demands of their business, and B, they need a sound infrastructure to get their goods and services to market. So those are two things we can help accommodate them with. We've certainly lowered their taxes over the last few years. No one can argue with that. So the reality is we need to start investing in New York, in our schools, in our cities, in our towns, in our villages, and our people. And until we do that, we're not going to reverse this problem.
We have time for maybe 2 questions. Just raise your hand if you have a brief question for our panel. Again, we've talked about education, mandate relief, We've talked about funding equity. Nobody? Everybody's tired? Oh, right over
I
here.
got one over
I would
here.
just like to say that regarding teacher evaluation, under this new APPR system, evaluating teachers has become more important than teaching students, and that's the wrong way to go.
I'm betting a lot of people in this room agree. Anybody
Lot of
else?
nodding heads.
Marion?
Yes, our league in Florida has the opposite lobbying issue compared to New York. They already have a tuition tax credit program, but they're just beginning to identify charter school problems, and so they're very focused on how can they get better accountability. I have a question for anybody who either has worked with the SED or works closely with the staffing on charter school monitoring. A statement was made to me a long time ago when we did our charter school study, that every time you create a new charter, it's analogous to creating a new school district because it has to be monitored in its unique comparative fashion. So our Florida League, I think, came out with some sort of recommended guideline for the ratio of SED staff, or whether it's SED or whatever the chartering organization may be, of how it should be, how many people do you need to monitor charter schools? And
Bob, do you know?
Should that be a factor in determining whether there's an increase in the cap?
I'm really not sure.
Is there anybody here who, come on, Peter.
Look, I'm going to save Peter from having to shout an answer from this table. I know he looks pained. The fact is, the SEDs, the State Education Department is living on a shoestring. It's 90-something%. I'm going to hazard a guess, 95% at least federally funded. Very little state support, and these bureaus are tiny. They often rely on a fellows program that's externally funded. There's been a problem, I think, with too much reliance on outsourcing policy because of the fact that a lot of their historical infrastructure to be able to meet their public service mission has been hollowed out. But no, I don't think they've got the staff now to hold the current number of schools in any realistic way accountable, in the sense that you have a level playing field and that you're making sure that you have access and it's fair. And we see that borne out by very low levels of English language learners, students with disabilities enrolled in these schools. We have policies and statutes that address this, but that's just words on paper or electron. I know I'm out of date, electrons. And there's been very little improvement on issues that were already addressed 4 years ago on reform through either lack of will or lack of capacity.
Well, and I think, oh, no, go ahead. Go ahead, Professor.
Well, I wanted to change the subject from school.
You have to go over here so that they...
Oh.
I want to change the subject from schools back to local government for just a minute. And, you have a balance between redistributive expenditures and development promotion expenditures. And traditionally, we understand that local government is the development promoting level of government. It pays for that infrastructure. It pays for that education that helps build development. And that the state, the higher level of government, is responsible for redistribution because poor people are unevenly distributed across the state. What's happened in New York is that the state has decentralized, passed down its redistributive expenditure responsibilities so heavily to the local governments, more so than any but 45 other states in the nation. New York is in the bottom 5 for doing that, that now local government in New York and our models shows that local government is so burdened by redistributive expenditures it can't play its developmental role. And so we've actually graphed this and looked at it, and New York is not competing well at the local government level because of the state pushing down these redistributive expenditures, whereas other localities and other states are able to do this because their states are playing their role in redistribution. So it's really scary to look at the map. I grew up in Georgia, and Georgia has communities that are moving forward because local government isn't so heavily taxed by the state pushing down these responsibilities. We got to get the balance back.
And when's your appointment with the governor?
Right.
Anytime.
We're out of time, but thank you so much. You guys were great.
And can we get a round of applause for the great, incredible, incomparable Susan Arbetter?
Yay.
First, anyone's red notebook? If it is, come up and see me. So we just wanted to close this out by saying thank you. This was a collaborative effort. We won't rename everyone, but I think we named everyone at the very beginning. You will be sent a link to a web-based evaluation probably tomorrow, so make sure you fill that out. There are still lots of resources on the table. No one wants to take them home with us, so please pick up resources during the social hour, which I think is just out back. And remember the robust set of resources on the website. We'll post things that weren't posted yet today, sometime in the next few days, including, I think, eventually the link to what was recorded today. So give us a couple of days. But thank you very much. Remember, this is a continuing dialogue. So we want to find the next time to kind of keep bringing people together to continue the dialogue.
And I wanted to thank you all as well, and I wanted to make sure that we thanked all the students and gave them a great round of applause for a great semester worth of work. And I'd give you all an A if I was grading, but Mildred will do something different. The important part here, and Rod just said it, is that we're hoping that this is the beginning of a dialogue that continues on, that in a few weeks the budget's going to be due, the fight is going to start. The reason we started this conference now was that we could have a civil discussion before all of the craziness starts to happen. So we're hoping that you will continue to work with us, and that this is not the last time that we see all of you here, that we see you over and over again, and we're looking forward to working with you. So thank you very much for everybody coming.
And do stay for a drink or whatever outside these doors.